Hi everyone, sorry for cutting off in the middle of this slide. So we're now going to move from interpretivism to the more empowerment paradigm focused approaches towards science. One of those is constructivism. So constructivism proposes that scientists should try to understand grief. So again, we're still talking in the subjective, interpretivist sort of framework, but in terms of how different stakeholders understand what it is. Scientists should try and build consensus on grief based on what different stakeholders say. So it might be a matter of talking to the people who are currently experiencing grief, their family members, their friends, the people who interact with them. A whole host of different stakeholders would go into a constructivist process to try and understand what grief is. More importantly, constructivists also say that as a part of the process, that the research process should change how individuals and systems understand what grief is. That the research process doesn't exist just to generate social science knowledge, but also to change the people who participate inside of it and the systems with which they interact. Participatory action research is another empowerment-focused approach towards social scientific research. Participatory action research states that scientists' definitions of grief are going to differ from the definitions of non-scientists, and that scientists should value the knowledge of grief possessed by community members impacted by grief at least as much as scientific knowledge. So if you are going to do a study of grief using participatory action research, what you should be focusing on, and the person whose knowledge is really the most important, are the people who are actually experiencing it. So those people should be involved and should be co-directors of all parts of the research process. They're going to tell you what parts of grief are the most important. They're going to tell you what grief actually means and what sort of social scientific knowledge would actually be useful inside of that system. Feminist research, lastly, is another sort of critical or empowerment-focused approach towards social science. So scientific definitions of grief are going to be shaped by sexism. Feminist research also extends to racism and ableism and all of the isms. So feminist researchers might say that women and other oppressed groups have been systematically excluded from the scientific process. Therefore, our scientific definitions of grief may not actually be as objective or as correct as we think that they are. In fact, individuals' definitions of grief are also structured by these different oppressive processes. So the only way that we can get to a scientific understanding of what grief is by accounting for that history, accounting for that oppression, and trying to respond proactively to it, and trying to privilege the voices of oppressed people. So this is from a book called Sociological Paradigms and Organizational Analysis. This is a way of sort of picturing the subjective and objective dimensions, and then status quo versus radical change dimensions of social scientific research. In the bottom right, we have functionalism or post-positivism. It's focused on objective reality, and it's focused on the status quo, what's happening right now. The purpose of post-positivistic research isn't to create change and to try and empower people. It's just to try and understand what's going on and how can we better predict what is going on. The interpretivist paradigm, which we've talked about, is also focused on subjectivity. So they're focused on understanding rather than predicting, but they're also just talking about what's happening right now. They're talking about the status quo. The job of an interpretivist researcher isn't to try and create change, it's just to try and describe the world as it is. Now, the more empowerment-focused ones are going to be towards the top of this diagram. So that is where the radical part comes in. The radical structuralists are going to focus on these sort of objective forces inside of society. These things like racism and sexism, that sort of stuff. So those are objective structures that exist in society, and the goal of research is to try and challenge and to try and overthrow those things and empower people who are oppressed by that. The radical humanist paradigm focuses on the more subjective parts of that. So it's focusing on individual liberation from those sort of oppressive forces. So in a radical humanist paradigm, you're really concerned with that individual's liberation. The radical structurists are concerned with the liberation of different classes and groups of people. This is something that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me. If this doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense to you, that's okay. But you should be able to understand, at least conversationally, what paradigms are and how they sort of relate to the different theories and how we approach social science. The last thing I want to note for Chapter 3 is intersubjectivity. So subjectivity doesn't just exist in my mind and in your mind, but we also talk to each other. Your book talks about this in terms of agreement reality. So in thinking about the terms of objectivity and subjectivity, complete objectivity is impossible. No matter how much I distance myself from what's going on, I'm impacted. My social science investigation is impacted by the biases that I bring to the table, by my experiences, by what we all agree things actually mean and how they work in the real world. All of that stuff is just kind of impossible to get out of. In order to step outside of that, you would have to step outside of reality itself. At the same time, complete subjectivity is kind of meaningless. It's just playing around inside of your own head. That's not really a science. So what social science, especially the more interpretivistically minded social sciences, try and focus on is intersubjectivity, or agreement reality. So we try and figure out the degree to which people agree on different topics. And that helps us understand what a phenomenon in the social world. So some different ways to minimize subjectivity might be to use people who are blind. If you guys have heard of the idea of double-blind experiments, that means the participants in an experiment and the researchers don't know whether that participant is getting the experimental condition or the control condition. You can use existing records. You can use deception with different safeguards. All of those things might minimize subjectivity. You need to also manage subjectivity. You need to acknowledge the limitations and seek out alternative perspectives inside of your study. Chapter 4, Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. So the methodology that you end up choosing is going to be influenced by a whole host of different things. One of those things, and the most important thing, is the question that you are actually asking. There are qualitative research questions, there are quantitative research questions. They look kind of different and they ask different things. We're going to go over what that means on the 27th when you guys are going to do your first draft of your research question. It's also going to be influenced by the purpose of your research. Is your research to try and change the system? Is your purpose to try and just describe what reality exists right now? You also might be influenced by different practical constraints. A lot of the projects that we work on inside of our graduate program are qualitative because to do a good large-scale quantitative study is kind of difficult inside of a graduate program. You don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of resources, and so just practically, most people tend to go towards the qualitative side. You might also be influenced by different ethical considerations or the paradigm of your researcher, the paradigm of the context that you're in, and the theory or model being tested. So like we talked about in the last section, paradigms are a place where sort of theories, even researchers, practice models, all of those things exist. So exchange theory or rational choice theory is definitely within the post-positivistic or functionalist paradigm. It's really just trying to observe objectively the costs and benefits of a given action. That is a post-positivistic paradigm. If we're talking about things like maybe motivational interviewing, we're probably going more in the direction of interpretivism. We're talking about that person's goals. We're talking about what makes sense to them, and whether their current behaviors are actually matching up with that stuff. We're really taking a more subjective approach rather than an objective approach. So these are affectionately known as flavors of social work research. So different flavors might be delineated by methodology. You can have qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, where you have both. And also by specific kinds of methodologies like survey research, historical research, single subjects, things like that. Flavors of social work research might also vary by whether they're basic research or applied research. Basic research is just knowledge for knowledge's sake. Most social work research, though, is applied. The purpose of social work research, generally speaking, is to inform practice. And that's exactly what applied research tries to do. So let's go over the big methodology terms. Quantitative methods have to do with quantities or numbers. So it has to do with the traditional scientific method, measurement. Um, Objective truth is the most valued part of this. So quantitative methods focus on precisely measuring things, building statistical relationships between the quantitative measurements, using deductive reasoning to create hypotheses, and to try and replicate studies that have come before. Um, Quantitative methods are relatively simple once you understand the rules. It's just some basic formal logic that you guys will cue into pretty quickly, and that can help you evaluate the quality of a study. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, instead of just focusing on what's true for everybody and those nomothetic causal explanations, we're trying to understand the deeper structures of what's going on. We're trying to understand the meaning that people ascribe to different social phenomenon. And part of that is involved with understanding how people story their own lives. Inside of qualitative research, we're looking for one truth in a sea of truths, rather than looking at the truth that we can find with a capital T that is true for everybody. We're trying to find all of the truths that exist for our participants. And instead of trying to measure things precisely using numerical methods, we're just trying to make sure that our participants and the report that we end up creating through our study is trustworthy, that we can say that the conclusions that we came to are grounded in what people have said, that what people have said, they weren't trying to trick us, that they were being genuine and honest. All of those speak to the trustworthiness of a product. We're focusing mostly on inductive reasoning, gathering a lot of data, usually word data through interviews and focus groups and things like that, and trying to come up with some themes and generalizations that we can make based on that data. Now, replication is challenging in qualitative study because as a social scientist, you are the instrument. You are the person doing data analysis. In quantitative methods, you're going to choose a test, like a chi-square test or a correlation test. Qualitative methods, you don't really have that. The test, the data analysis that you do, is sort of unique to you. You try and bound your own subjectivity, your own biases, and try and approach it from the perspective of your participants. But you're going to come up with slightly different answers, or maybe very different answers, than somebody else who's going to look at that same data. That doesn't mean that qualitative methods is unscientific. It means that as long as you go through a rigorous process that is grounded in social science, you are doing good qualitative research. So you don't necessarily have to choose one method or the other. You can, in fact, choose both, something that's called mixed methods. So mixed methods would allow you to combine both quantitative methods and qualitative methods, and maybe end up with the best of both worlds, both a deep understanding from the perspective of your participants, as well as something you can use to make nomothetical causal explanations or generalizations about what everybody inside of a population might experience. Or you can end up with a study that has some of the limitations of both, where qualitative stuff you may not be able to generalize as much, quantitative stuff you might lack depth. You might get some of the flaws from both of those things rather than just getting the benefits. So let's walk through an example of a study that I did. Oh, I don't think I have time to do that. All right, I'll see you guys in the next part.